There's something profoundly transformative, perhaps even revolutionary, about the moment when a person finally decides they're done, not in a careless or bitter way, but in a deeply conscious and resolute way. That kind of moment isn't anger, it isn't vengeance, it's clarity. Empathy is often misunderstood in our culture. It's usually portrayed as softness, as a form of gentle surrender to the emotional needs of others. And while empathy absolutely involves the ability to deeply understand and resonate with another person's feelings, that capacity doesn't imply weakness. In fact, genuine empathy is one of the most powerful qualities a human being can develop because it demands courage, discipline, and remarkable self-awareness. When we speak about empathy within the framework of narcissistic dynamics, we're not describing a superficial trait. We're referring to someone who feels deeply, someone capable of perceiving not just what another person says, but what they're truly experiencing beneath the surface. An empath doesn't merely hear words, they perceive meanings. They pick up on patterns, motives, and unspoken emotions. This is a form of psychological intuition that's often mistaken for emotional fragility. But it isn't fragility, not inherently. It's insight, it's emotional intelligence wrapped in compassion. Now, this is where the dynamic becomes especially fascinating. Narcissists, by their nature, are not interested in mutual understanding. They do not operate on the same emotional wavelength. Their inner world is built around control, attention, and the preservation of ego. To them, the empath isn't viewed as a person, but as a resource, a mirror, a source of validation that reflects back the admiration they crave. When an empath enters their orbit, it feels to the narcissist like a perfect match. On the surface, it is. The narcissist thrives on admiration, and the empath is naturally inclined to nurture, to understand, to give. But hidden beneath that harmony lies a dangerous imbalance. Empathy without boundaries turns into self-destruction, and that is where the real distinction begins. An empath who hasn't yet awakened to their own strength, who hasn't learned to value their own right to say no, becomes easy prey for narcissistic manipulation. Their compassion is weaponized against them. Their kindness becomes a leash around their soul. Slowly, they begin to doubt themselves. They start internalizing the narcissist's distorted reality. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. This psychological gaslighting corrodes the empath's sense of truth. They try harder, they give more, they sacrifice themselves in an attempt to preserve the illusion of love and connection. But here's the truth that changes everything. Empathy is only powerful when it's conscious, when it's aware of its own worth, when it no longer runs on autopilot, trying to earn affection or repair what cannot be repaired. That is the point when empathy transforms from passive sensitivity into active strength. It becomes selective, discerning, intentional. And that is precisely what makes it dangerous to the narcissist. Because a self-aware empath begins to see through their game, they stop reacting emotionally to every provocation. They stop justifying themselves, explaining themselves, defending their perception of reality. They stop carrying guilt that never belonged to them in the first place. Most importantly, they stop trying to rescue someone who does not want to be rescued. They come to understand that compassion doesn't mean self-sacrifice, that love without mutual respect is not love at all, it's servitude. And when that realization hits, they begin to redirect their empathy inward toward themselves. That is the pivotal moment when everything shifts, when empathy evolves from reactive caregiving into empowered sovereignty. And that transformation terrifies the narcissist because the empath ceases to be a predictable source of emotional supply. The empath no longer soothes the narcissist's insecurities or inflates their fragile ego. They become calm, quiet, detached. And in the narcissist's world, that calm is the ultimate threat because control requires reaction, and when reaction disappears, control collapses. Empathy at its highest form demands strength, the strength to feel everything without losing yourself, to perceive clearly without denying the truth, to care deeply without surrendering your boundaries. This kind of empathy is not naive. It is forged in fire. It is earned through heartbreak and the long, painful walk through emotional abuse, emerging with one's identity intact and stronger than before. Narcissists operate from a fundamentally different psychological architecture than most people realize. Deep down, they are not driven by logic or empathy, but by manipulation and dominance. They construct a reality in which they are the center, the authority, and the eternal victim all at once. To sustain that illusion, they surround themselves with people who continually mirror back their desired image, people who validate, who comply, who emotionally accommodate. That's the cornerstone of their power. Not truth, not reason, but compliance. And this compliance is emotional, not intellectual. You can't out-reason a narcissist. You can't win an argument because the argument was never about truth. It was about control. It's about shifting blame, distorting reality, and preserving their superiority or victimhood. They don't debate to understand. They debate to dominate. They don't listen to hear. They listen to collect ammunition. Within this dynamic, logic becomes meaningless. You can offer the clearest facts, the most sound explanations, and they'll twist, deflect, or ignore everything. Because what they fear most isn't your evidence, it's your emotional independence. This is why empaths are such valuable targets. An empath brings profound emotional attunement and an almost instinctive desire to see the best in others. They forgive quickly, understand deeply, and empathize even when it hurts. In a healthy relationship, that's a beautiful trait. But in a relationship with a narcissist, it becomes the very trait that ensnares them. The narcissist recognizes this early on. They test boundaries subtly. They observe how much the empath tolerates, how readily they apologize, how far they're willing to bend to avoid conflict. Once they see that emotional compliance is available, they exploit it fully. Over time, the empath becomes trapped in a pattern of emotional confusion. They start defending actions they didn't commit, apologizing for emotions they never expressed, and doubting their own memories. They begin questioning their instincts, perceptions, and even their own identity. This erosion of self is no accident. It's a deliberate psychological design. The more uncertain and emotionally unstable the empath feels, the more leverage the narcissist gains. The struggle has never been about truth. It has always been about emotional control. Narcissists don't seek to resolve conflict. They thrive on perpetuating it, not overtly, but covertly. They maintain just enough chaos to keep the empath reactive, emotionally invested, and perpetually attempting to fix things. The more the empath invests, the more emotional energy the narcissist consumes. As the cycle continues, gaslighting, projection, blame shifting, the empath doubles down on their efforts to understand, to calm, to repair. But again, the narcissist isn't looking for understanding. They're looking for submission. They crave domination disguised as dialogue. Many empaths are intelligent, insightful, even highly self-aware. Yet intelligence alone doesn't protect against emotional entrapment. Because this trap isn't logical, it's emotional. It's constructed through conditioning, through subtle repetition. The narcissist trains the empath to associate peace with compliance, love with self-sacrifice, and connection with chaos. Gradually, the empath learns to anticipate reactions, to modify their tone, their words, even their behavior to avoid conflict. And in doing so, they lose touch with their authentic emotional landscape. The narcissist succeeds not by being right, but by ensuring the empath feels wrong. They don't need to tell the truth. They just need to make the empath feel guilty. They manipulate emotions, not facts. Once the empath accepts the unspoken role of caretaker in a one-sided relationship, the narcissist has all the control they need. Their power rests not on truth, but on emotional reflexes, on guilt, hope, and fear. The only way to escape this cycle is not through argument, confrontation, or proof. It's through emotional detachment, because when the empath no longer feels compelled to prove, to explain, or to appease, the narcissist's tactics begin to crumble. The manipulative energy loses its hold. The narcissist cannot function in an emotionally neutral space. They cannot manipulate someone who refuses to react. They cannot dominate a person who no longer internalizes their chaos. And that's the ultimate liberation. The moment when the empath stops trying to win love through pain, stops offering understanding to someone incapable of reciprocating, and starts reclaiming their emotional autonomy. That is the rebirth of empathy, not as submission, but as strength, not as endless giving, but as conscious choice. And once that transformation happens, the narcissist's power fades into irrelevance, because they can no longer thrive where authenticity lives. Boundaries are often misunderstood, especially by those who have spent their lives prioritizing the emotions and needs of others. For an empath, the concept of setting a boundary can initially feel like a betrayal of their very essence, of their compassion, openness, and desire for connection. But in truth, boundaries are not barriers meant to exclude people. They are the lines that define where the self begins and where it ends. And for an empath, learning to draw those lines marks the beginning of awakening to their genuine strength and personal authority. In relationships with narcissists, boundaries are the first things to be tested, pushed, and eventually violated. Narcissists operate from a place of entitlement. They believe they deserve constant attention, admiration, validation, and control over how others perceive them. When an empath steps into their world, they are greeted with charm, affection, and the illusion of deep emotional intimacy. The narcissist quickly identifies the empath's natural instincts to nurture, to listen, and to avoid conflict. These traits are then exploited to slowly dismantle the empath's sense of individuality and personal space. The erosion of boundaries in this dynamic is rarely immediate. It begins subtly, through seemingly small compromises, ignoring a red flag, excusing a cruel comment, allowing disrespect because they're just stressed or they didn't mean it. The empath rationalizes these behaviors, believing in forgiveness, growth, and understanding the pain of others. Yet each concession becomes a small step away from their own center. Over time, the empath finds themselves justifying the narcissist's actions, prioritizing their moods, and sacrificing their own peace to maintain harmony. What makes this cycle so destructive is that it masquerades as love. The narcissist frames the empath's resistance as selfishness, their boundaries as cruelty, and their independence as betrayal. They condition the empath to associate self-assertion with guilt. They twist boundaries into rejection. This emotional inversion keeps the empath stuck in a loop of guilt, confusion, and overcompensation. The more they attempt to reclaim their space, the more backlash they encounter. It becomes easier to surrender than to keep fighting for clarity. Awakening comes when the empath finally recognizes the price of that surrender, when the fatigue becomes unbearable, when the internal dissonance becomes too loud to ignore. The empath begins to question not only the narcissist, but the entire foundation of the relationship. They start asking new questions. What do I truly need? What do I honestly feel? What is no longer acceptable to me? These questions mark the beginning of transformation because they lay the groundwork upon which boundaries are built. Establishing boundaries is not an act of rebellion against the narcissist. It's a declaration of self-worth. It's the moment the empath stops defining themselves by what they give and begins to understand who they are. A boundary is not about changing another person's behavior. It's about defining what you will no longer permit in your life. It's not about control, it's about clarity. Clarity about what honors your peace, what supports your emotional balance, and what truly reflects respect for yourself. When an empath begins setting boundaries, the narcissist often responds with anger, confusion, or strategic manipulation. They are not accustomed to resistance, not used to hearing no. That simple word threatens their illusion of dominance. It interrupts the emotional economy they've built, where the empath endlessly gives and the narcissist endlessly takes. A boundary exposes this imbalance. It forces the narcissist to confront a truth they've long avoided, that other people exist as separate, autonomous beings. This confrontation is intolerable to them, and they often escalate their behavior to regain control. They may resort to guilt tripping, playing the victim, or suddenly reverting to love bombing, offering affection or apologies to restore the old dynamic. But once the empath has experienced the power of authentic boundaries, something irreversible takes root. They begin to see the pattern. They trust their instincts over the narcissist's manipulative narrative. They stop feeling responsible for someone else's emotional regulation. And most importantly, they realize they have the right to take up space, to have needs, and to say no without guilt or justification. Boundaries are not mere limits. They are declarations of identity. They are the architecture of self-respect. For the empath, they represent a radical shift from seeking external approval to aligning with inner truth. They signify the transformation from emotional servitude to personal sovereignty. And though they may initially bring conflict or discomfort, they ultimately create clarity, peace, and genuine freedom. Detachment, too, is often misunderstood, especially by those who have been conditioned to equate love with sacrifice, attention with care, and presence with obligation. For empaths, detachment may initially feel cold, heartless, or even cruel. They are used to being emotionally available, ever-present, and deeply invested in the well-being of others. Yet, in the presence of a narcissistic dynamic, this emotional openness becomes a liability rather than a strength. In the hands of a narcissist, every emotional reaction becomes a point of leverage. Every vulnerability becomes an opportunity for control. The more reactive the empath is, the greater the narcissist's hold. Narcissists thrive in environments filled with emotional volatility. They feed on confusion, chaos, and intensity. The constant highs and lows they orchestrate keep the empath in a perpetual state of emotional survival, always striving to soothe, fix, or comprehend what's happening. They draw the empath into a psychological maze where the rules constantly change and the finish line keeps moving. It's not logic that ensnares the empath, it's emotional entanglement. The more they care, the deeper they sink. The more they explain, the more trapped they become. And all the while, the narcissist feeds on their attention, their apologies, their desperate attempts to bring peace. In this context, detachment becomes an act of radical self-preservation. It is not a sign of indifference, but a decision to step away from a system built on emotional enslavement. Detachment means refusing to participate in manipulation. It is the refusal to be pulled into false narratives or manufactured crises. It's the moment the empath stops reacting, stops defending, and stops explaining. This change dismantles the narcissist's entire structure of control. Where once there was argument, there is now silence. Where there was justification, there is now composure. The narcissist is no longer receiving the emotional energy they rely upon to feel powerful. They may escalate, provoke, or even plead in desperation to reignite the old emotional exchange. But detachment, once genuine, is difficult to reverse. The empath no longer feels the need to win an argument, clarify misunderstandings, or earn approval. They realize there's nothing left to prove and nothing left to fix. The game only exists as long as they continue to play. Detachment brings a clarity that was once hidden behind emotional fog. From this vantage point, the narcissist's patterns become obvious. The cycles of love bombing, devaluation, and discard lose their illusion of unpredictability. The promises sound rehearsed, the apologies hollow, the charm mechanical. The empath begins to see that they no longer need to decode or interpret the narcissist's behavior. It's not their job to understand someone else's dysfunction. This realization is profoundly freeing. It allows the empath to reclaim their emotional energy and redirect it inward. Instead of pouring their life into healing another, they begin to heal themselves. They establish stronger boundaries, rediscover forgotten passions, and reconnect with their inner voice. Detachment creates space for truth, stillness, and reflection. In that space, the empath finds a peace they might never have believed was possible. The narcissist, meanwhile, is destabilized by this transformation. They are no longer the center of attention. They no longer control the empath's emotions. In response, they may lash out, manipulate, or feign affection to pull the empath back. But the empath, now grounded in emotional clarity, sees through these tactics. They no longer feel compelled to rescue, absorb, or engage. Their self-worth is no longer tethered to the narcissist's approval or rejection. Detachment does not mean the absence of empathy. It means understanding that empathy can exist without emotional bondage. It is the awareness that you can care without surrendering yourself. It is realizing that love, when it demands your destruction, is not love at all. For the empath, detachment marks a profound return to emotional sovereignty. It is the process of stepping out of the narcissist's shadow and into the illumination of one's own truth. Healing is not merely about moving on. It is about reclaiming the lost fragments of yourself that were buried under the weight of trying to love someone incapable of healthy love. It is about remembering that your compassion was never the problem. It was simply misplaced in someone who could not receive it without distortion. And when that truth is fully embraced, healing ceases to be recovery. It becomes rebirth. For the empath who has endured a relationship with a narcissist, healing becomes a revolutionary act. It is the gradual unraveling of all the false beliefs that were planted through manipulation, emotional conditioning, and psychological control. It's the slow, painful rediscovery of who you were before your identity was molded around someone else's dysfunction. Narcissists operate through control, not just overt commands or domination, but subtle, insidious influence that slowly corrodes self-trust and independence. They rewrite reality through gaslighting, distort perception through projection, and reframe their cruelty as your fault. Over time, the empath internalizes these distortions. They begin to question their own intentions, doubt their memories, and suppress their emotions. They adapt in order to survive, often losing the ability to tell the difference between love and obligation, kindness and compliance, compassion and codependence. But when the empath finally steps away from the relationship, physically, emotionally, or both, the healing process begins to illuminate everything that had been hidden in plain sight. Patterns that once felt confusing start to make sense. The cycles of abuse that were once normalized begin to appear grotesque in hindsight. The constant emotional exhaustion, the anxiety, the chronic guilt, it all begins to connect. The empath realizes that the problem was never their capacity to love, but the absence of reciprocity and respect. They see that being endlessly compassionate in a one-sided relationship is not noble, it's self-destructive. Healing breaks the narcissist's psychological grip because it represents complete withdrawal from the game they were playing. The narcissist feeds on attention, reactions, and the ability to shape how others feel. When the empath begins to heal, that supply disappears. They stop answering the late-night messages, stop explaining themselves, stop seeking closure from someone incapable of giving it. They stop needing validation from the very person who caused the pain. This shift is devastating to the narcissist because it shatters their illusion of control. They can no longer reach into the empath's emotional world to stir chaos. The empath becomes unavailable to be triggered, manipulated, or guilt-tripped. And because narcissists rarely self-reflect, they interpret this emotional detachment as betrayal or cruelty, never realizing that it's actually self-preservation. The empath isn't playing hard to get, they are simply gone, emotionally and spiritually. As the empath heals, they begin to rebuild their identity from the ground up. They learn to listen to their inner voice again. They practice saying no without guilt. They rediscover joy, solitude, strength, and boundaries. They form new connections rooted in mutual respect and emotional safety. Their world shifts from one of survival to one of genuine living. The scars remain, but they no longer define who the empath is. They serve as reminders of resilience, not of failure. In this process, the empath also comes to understand that healing is not linear. There are moments of deep clarity followed by waves of grief. There are days when the memories ache and days when freedom feels exhilarating. Yet each step, no matter how uncertain, moves them closer to wholeness. With every step forward, the narcissist's influence fades. Their once powerful voice becomes faint, their opinions lose weight, their approval becomes irrelevant. Healing also brings new levels of discernment. The empath becomes skilled at spotting red flags early, trusting their intuition, and walking away from dynamics that mirror old patterns. They no longer mistake chaos for passion or manipulation for affection. They learn to differentiate between emotional connection and emotional dependency. They begin to choose peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over temporary validation. This transformation is irreversible. Once the empath sees the truth, they cannot unsee it. Once they feel the strength of self-trust, they can never again tolerate self-abandonment. The narcissist who once held immense psychological control becomes just another person, powerless to shape their emotions or identity. Healing transforms the empath from a source of supply into a sovereign being. Someone who has reclaimed their autonomy, their voice, and their life. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when silence speaks louder than words. When the absence of reaction becomes the most powerful response of all. That moment, the quiet departure without pleading, without explaining, without one last conversation, is the birth of true liberation. For the narcissist, this silence is incomprehensible. They are addicted to chaos, to drama, to emotional explosions that leave the door open for re-entry. They expect the empath to cry, to beg, to explain. But when the empath has truly had enough, there is no scene, no confrontation, only stillness, and that silence carries more power than any outburst ever could. Narcissists operate in predictable cycles: idealization, devaluation, discard, and hoovering. This sequence is not random, it's engineered. Each stage keeps the empath emotionally hooked, hoping this time will be different, that understanding will finally be mutual. The narcissist knows exactly how to feed that hope, offering just enough affection or validation to keep the empath invested. But once the empath awakens to the pattern, once they stop hoping, stop justifying, stop participating, they break the cycle. And nothing threatens the narcissist more than a cycle that cannot complete itself. Walking away is not just physical distance, it's emotional and psychological separation. It's no longer seeking closure, no longer dissecting the narcissist's motives, no longer taking responsibility for their dysfunction. It's not an act of bitterness, it's an act of clarity. The empath finally understands that nothing will change, that no apology will be authentic, that no explanation will make the abuse rational. They stop seeking understanding from someone who never intended to be understood, and in doing so, they reclaim their peace. This kind of departure feels different. Narcissists depend on unfinished business. They thrive on open doors and loose ends. But when the empath walks away cleanly with emotional neutrality, it sends a message the narcissist cannot twist or manipulate. I see you, I understand, and I am done. There's nothing left to argue, no emotional leverage to exploit. The narcissist, once fueled by the empath's emotional energy, now faces silence, an emptiness they cannot control. The power in this moment doesn't come from revenge or superiority. It comes from healing. The empath no longer walks away out of desperation or pain. They leave because they've remembered their worth. They no longer need to prove the harm done, nor do they crave acknowledgement. They finally grasp that the narcissist's inability to love was never a reflection of their inadequacy, but of the narcissist's limitation. And once this truth settles deeply, there is nothing left to say. This silence is not emptiness, it is fullness, it is resolve. Every step away from the narcissist is a step towards self-liberation. And while the narcissist may attempt to provoke, to guilt trip, or to reignite contact through nostalgia, none of it lands anymore. The empath sees through every tactic. The guilt no longer hooks them, the charm no longer entices. The manipulation that once seemed powerful now appears transparent and desperate. What once resembled love is clearly revealed as control. The narcissist may spin stories, play the victim, or gather allies to question the empath's integrity. But even that holds no weight when the empath no longer plays the game. When they walk away without defending themselves, they choose peace over perception. They understand that no amount of explanation will ever satisfy a narcissist's craving for dominance. By refusing to participate in the drama, they end the performance entirely, not with a loud finale, but with the quiet dignity of someone who knows their worth. To outsiders, this departure may look sudden, but for the empath, it's the result of countless small betrayals, moments of silent heartbreak, and years of trying to make it work. It's the product of endless inner conflict, of hope colliding with reality. And when that final boundary is crossed, the decision is already made. There's no anger left, only certainty. This kind of silence is deafening to the narcissist. It mirrors a type of power they cannot comprehend, a power that doesn't shout, doesn't chase, doesn't beg. It simply leaves and never turns back. And in that quiet exit, the empath is reborn. They are no longer the person who once tolerated, explained, or endured. They are someone new, someone whole, someone free, someone who finally understands that walking away was never the end. It was the beginning of becoming.